Amen. Thank you, praise team, and good morning, Redemption Church. Good morning. We are glad to have you here today, and if you are our guest this morning, I hope you have been made to feel welcome and at home. And if there's anything we can help you with as a church, any way we can pray with you, or any questions that you may have, we want to help you just in any way that we can do that. But thank you for being here today. If you got your Bibles, I invite you to find John chapter 11 this morning. John chapter 11, we're going to be continuing today in our series where we're walking through the Gospel of John together. And while you're finding that, I want to recommend to you this morning, there is a documentary that's streaming on Netflix right now. At least I believe it is. It's a couple months since I watched it, but I think it's still there. There's a documentary I want to recommend that is fascinating. And the name of the documentary is Behind the Curve. And if you haven't seen it, if you're not familiar with it, it's a documentary that follows some of the leading celebrities and voices in the Flat Earth movement. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Flat Earth movement. If you're a part of the Flat Earth movement, we love you. We're glad you're here today. But basically, as I understand it, in the way the documentary explains it, as those that are part of this movement believe that rather than the earth being a globe or a sphere, the earth is a round disc. And so if you kind of picture the face of a watch in your mind, that the earth is a round disc that is covered by this massive dome that contains all of our atmosphere, and that also contains the sun and the moon. And the sun and the moon rotate around that, kind of like the arms on a watch, around inside of that dome, around this disc. And that what holds this kind of all in place is that Antarctica, rather than being a continent, is this massive wall of ice that surrounds the outside of this disc and kind of holds everything in. And so that's kind of the view. But what I loved about this documentary, and what was great about it, is that it's not trying to make fun of people that believe in the flat earth. It's not a satire or anything like that. That it just speaks, the camera's following them around, and I think gives a really honest representation, lets them speak and show and say what they believe and why they believe it. And so in that sense, it's really fascinating, and I think it gives a fair representation. But what's interesting in that is that along the way in the course of this documentary, they do a couple different experiments that they think will prove their theory that the earth is flat, but actually the evidence from those experiments actually points in the direct opposite direction. And how they react to that's kind of just fascinating to watch. One of those, the last experiment in the film that it ends with, this group of people set up two platforms 4 miles apart on a flat plain. And picture like a 4x8 piece of plywood standing on its end. They set it up and they drill a hole like 4 feet up in that, about this big. And kind of the plan is they have this hole, and then 4 miles away they set up another one that's exactly the same with a hole in the same spot, and they've got all of the survey equipment and lasers and everything so that they can make sure these two circles 4 miles apart are suspended at exactly the same height. Does that make sense? And so what the plan is then, somebody to stand on one end of one of those platforms in the dark and shine this really powerful light through that first hole. And the theory being that if the earth is flat, that somebody standing on the far side of the second hole would be able to see the light shining through, because it would shine, makes sense, right? Shines in a straight line through the one hole, all the way across through the second hole, they'd be able to see it. So they get it all set up, the night of the experiment comes, darkness falls, they've got headsets and computers, and they're talking in communication with each other, they're ready to do it, and they turn the light on, and the people on the far end are like, go ahead and turn the light on. And we did turn the light on. Well, we're not seeing anything on our end. And they begin to try to figure it out. Why isn't this working? Why don't we see it? And they finally tell the people on the far end with the light, raise your light a little higher. And so they raise that light on the far end higher where it's shining down through that hole. And lo and behold, when they do that, all of a sudden they can see the light on the far end, which is exactly what you would expect if the earth is a sphere and curved over space. Now, the fascinating part about that documentary is their reaction to that. That rather than go, Maybe we need to rethink our theory. Maybe we need to go back to the drawing board on this. The reaction is, well, that's disappointing. And they move right on, believing in a flat earth. And so it's a fascinating documentary of the standpoint of how we come to believe the things that we do and how we weigh evidence, and that once as human beings something reaches the level of worldview status in our minds, once we have decided this is the way the world is, it is incredibly difficult to change our minds. And that's true of all of us. And we see that taking place in our text today, and I think you'll see why, how that becomes clear as we move through John chapter 11 today. Now, John has been very specific going through his gospel in sharing 7 miracles. John calls them signs in the gospel. Only 7 miracles John shares all the way through his gospel. And he tells us why. The beginning of the book, John chapter 1, he tells us his reason in writing in the very first chapter. That in the beginning the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and his whole premise is to demonstrate that Jesus was God in the flesh. Jesus was God in human form as a human being. And so he shares these signs as demonstrations of that fact. And so we've seen walking through John that Jesus turned the water into wine in Cana of Galilee. He healed the official's servant, and that's when he did it from a distance. He didn't even have to be there. He healed the man who had been lame. He fed 5,000 people with a couple loaves of bread and a couple pieces of fish, gave them all a fish fillet sandwich with plenty left over to spare at the end. What's the next one? I lost my train of thought. Anybody know? Feeding the 5,000, Jesus walked on water. Sometimes it just takes my brain a minute. He walked on water. He healed the man who had been born blind. And if you've been here, you remember all the debate about that. And then he tells us at the end of his gospel that I couldn't tell you about all of them. If I wrote about all of the signs and all the miracles that Jesus did, he says with a bit of hyperbole, I suppose all of the books in the world wouldn't even be able to contain it if I wrote about all of them. We've been studying the last few weeks the 7th miracle and the last miracle recorded in John, and the grandest of all of Jesus' miracles, when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. And it's important to point out that when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, Lazarus wasn't just a little bit dead, right? Lazarus hadn't been, it's not like he'd been dead just for an hour or two or for a few minutes where there could be any mistake about it. And that's important because in the ancient world, you hear some of these stories, even in medieval times. They sometimes had a hard time determining the point of death, and there were people that they were certain were dead who came back. You know, you hear these stories about them burying people who were alive. That's no chance that's the case with Lazarus. He was as dead as anybody's ever been. And it's not like The Princess Bride. He wasn't just mostly dead, right? The best comedy movie ever, in my humble opinion. Lazarus wasn't just mostly dead. He'd been dead for 4 days. There had been a funeral. He had been embalmed. The stone had been rolled against the tomb. And if you've ever been around dead things very much, you'll know 4 days, there's a lot of bad stuff that starts to happen in terms of decomposition in 4 days. After 4 days, there's no doubt as to deadness. It's evident. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, and Jesus called him back to life with just a few simple words. And he came walking out of the tomb alive. And that caused quite a stir in the community where that happened, and that's where we pick up in our text today. John chapter 11, verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary to the funeral and had seen what he did, believed in him. Awesome, right? You know, I guess so. We'd like to all think, yeah, you'd believe, right? Somebody comes back to the dead that's been dead for 4 days, and wherever these people had been in their opinion of Jesus prior and their knowledge of his ministry and his miracles, this one pushes them over the tipping point of faith. Okay, he really is the Messiah. And so they put their faith and trust in him. But not everybody. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So there were some tattletales in the group. who right after learning the miracle and seeing the miracle of Lazarus coming back, they go running to tell the Pharisees about it. And it may not be that they had been upset about it. It may just be that the Pharisees were the ones that they looked up to as religious authority figures. And after seeing Lazarus come back from the dead, they're going, what on earth? What should we do? Is Jesus really the Messiah? And they might have just been going to the Pharisees with their questions. But how the Pharisees react and the religious leaders react is very important. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council. And let me just set the table if I can for a minute, because what's happening here is very important and will be very important in the weeks ahead as we study the last week of Jesus' life. In the first century, Judea was a province under Roman occupation and living under Roman rule. But for the most part, the Romans were fairly kind overlords. They allowed the people that they had conquered, and they ruled all of the Mediterranean world in the first century. A lot of different races and peoples that they were ruling over, but for the most part, they didn't require you to become Roman when they conquered you. That they would allow the peoples they conquered to continue to live with their own traditions and their own cultures and their own way of dress and, their own religion, all of those sorts of things. Rome didn't care. As long as you were a good citizen and paid your taxes, didn't cause problems, for the most part, they were good with it. So they allowed the Jews in Judea a great deal of freedom in ruling over themselves, particularly in religious matters. And in order to keep the Jews happy, they had gone to great lengths to keep them placated and happy. And Herod, at great expense to the Roman government, had spent decades rebuilding and remodeling the Temple Mount and the temple there in Jerusalem. And by the time he got done, it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. They also allowed the Jewish ruling council that this passage is talking about, the Sanhedrin, to rule over all religious affairs in Judea, and to some extent a great deal of even the civil affairs. And so that Sanhedrin is the council that's getting together. It'd kind of be our equivalent if you kind of mixed our Supreme Court and Senate into one body. That's kind of what the Sanhedrin was. It's made up of 70 men, and those men in that society and culture enjoyed a great deal of respect and prestige and wealth as a result of their positions. And now, as a result of this stir that Jesus has caused, they come together. And look at the hand-wringing that takes place. The chief priests and Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs." And what's fascinating to me here is they don't deny any of the miracles, right? It's not like they're going, "Guys, what are we going to do? We know this guy's a hoax. How are we going to prove that he didn't really raise Lazarus from the dead? How are we going to prove there was platforms under the water? He didn't really walk on water, right? And that guy hadn't really been blind from birth. How are we going to disprove all of these signs and discredit him?" It's interesting. They don't even try to deny it, that they admit he performs many miracles. It's interesting, though, that in light of all of the miracles and everything they had seen and everything they had heard from Jesus, they get together to try to figure out what to do about Jesus, and not one of the 70 goes, "I have an idea. Guys, I'm just saying, I'm not trying to cause a stir, but maybe, guys, just maybe, we should stop and consider, could he really be the Messiah?" Right? That would seem like at least a reasonable thing to have a debate on. He just raised a guy back from the dead. He's been running around claiming to be God and God in the flesh and saying the kingdom of God has come. Maybe we should at least consider it and talk about it, right? And they don't. And even in light of all of the evidence, just like those in the documentary, in light of all of the evidence, they still just choose to go, "No, that's not even an option that's on the table." Instead, what they come up with is much more drastic. So they say, "What are we going to do? He performs a lot of miracles, we admit that, but here's their worry. If we let him go on like this, everybody's going to believe in him." Now again, if Jesus really was the Messiah, you'd think that would be a good thing, right? Remember, they were looking for a political Messiah who would unite them to overthrow Rome. That's what they were planning on. That's what they were hoping for. So if Jesus was the Messiah, you'd think they would want as many people as possible to become his followers, but that's not what they want to happen. And we see a little bit about their intentions in the next statement, and here's where their hearts really begin to come through. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and here it is, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. That if we don't do something to stop this guy, and he keeps claiming getting followers, and more people keep coming to him, eventually news of his following is going to get back to Rome. Rome's going to think it's an insurgent movement, and they're going to send their armies here, and when their armies come, they are going to wipe us out. And all of this temple and everything we worked so hard for, and all of these positions that we enjoy, we're going to be the first to go when Rome's armies show up. And so their real concern in all of this, and I think what blinded them from being even able to consider the truth, is that in true politician fashion, they're just scared to death of losing office. And if we don't do something to stop Jesus, all of this privilege that we enjoy, and they all had comfortable lives, all of this privilege we enjoy is going to go away. And that's when one of them, Caiaphas, the high priest, he stands up and he says something that probably a lot of them were thinking, but nobody had the guts to say. Look at what Caiaphas says. Verse 49, one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." And finally, we have it on record with one of the Jewish leaders saying for the first time, Jesus has got to go. Now, they had tried to kill him previously, and we've seen that in John's Gospel. That was always in the heat of the moment, and the crowd thinking he was teaching blasphemy. They're going to pick up rocks, and they're going to try to kill him or try to stone him. But now we see for the first time on the floor of essentially the House of Representatives, one of their leaders saying in an official capacity, Jesus has got to die. But notice he's a good politician, and notice the language he couches it in. He doesn't just say, Jesus has got to die because I like being high priest and I'm terrified of losing office, which was the case. They have uncovered the remains of Caiaphas' house in first century Jerusalem. He was living in grand, luxurious style. He had a good life, and he was rich and respected, and everybody looked up to him. But notice his words. We have to do it for the sake of the country, right? Isn't that what politicians always say to get what they want through? We've got to do it for the good of the people, right? And it's almost like I think, doggone it, guys, I wish there was some other way around it. I hate it as much as you, but Jesus has got to go. And I know it's ugly business, boys, but sometimes that's what we got to do, that for the sake of the country, right? The country comes first. It's more important than any one man. So for the sake of the nation, Jesus has got to die. And so we have it on record for the first time. Now I want to ask you to use your imagination for just a minute before we read the next verse and try to pretend all of this story is new to you. And most of you, you're familiar with how this story is going to end. You know already that in a few weeks they are in fact going to succeed in killing Jesus, and that he's not going to stay dead, and he rises from the dead in the third day and he ascends into heaven, and you know how it all works out in the end. But try for a minute to pretend that you didn't. And you're one of John's first century readers who you've just received this text, and you are sitting down and you are reading this story for the first time, and you don't know what's getting ready to happen in the next few chapters. John clues us in a little editorial note here and a little detail that explains what's going on from a bigger picture perspective. Caiaphas says Jesus has got to go, and in verse 51, John adds this note. He didn't say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. That's for the Jews. And not only for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. That's all of us. Yay! And so from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. John says, big picture, there was a whole lot more going on here. And Caiaphas wasn't even aware of it, but he was speaking prophecy and fulfilling prophecy when he made this statement, even though he was saying it with evil intent. See, the Sanhedrin approached this from the perspective of, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about this guy, Jesus? Whatever we've done, it hasn't worked. He keeps gaining in popularity. More and more people are believing in him. It's come to the point, we've got to do something. What are we going to do? So they put their heads together. They come up with a plan. It seems like a good plan. They convince themselves it's a moral plan, right? It's a shame we've got to kill him, but it's for the good of the country, right? We're doing this for our nation so they can feel justified morally in doing it because they're doing it for the right reasons. So they can tell themselves all of these things. They come up with a good plan. It makes sense. They put that plan in action. And what John clues us in on is it was never their plan in the first place. That they thought they were the ones in control when the entire time they are playing right into God's hands and fulfilling God's plan. And really, that's the one point of this entire message. This is kind of a one-point sermon today. I think the one big truth that we learn from this passage is this. And the Bible teaches it throughout Scripture, but it's so clear in this passage. And that truth is this. God is in control always. God is in control all of the time. The $10 big theological word for that is that God is sovereign. When we talk about God being sovereign, though, that's what we really mean. That God is in control of all things, all the time, of the entire universe. He is in control of all of it. And everything happening in this chapter, in John chapter 11, is all part of a big plan that God has placed in motion the very moment Adam and Eve fell into sin. God set a plan in place to make things right again. And he used nations and empires all along the way to bring all of human history to this point, from the moment that he called Abraham and said, Abraham, I will make you a great nation. And then God used the Egyptians to care for them and to build them into a large nation in slavery in Egypt. And then God led them into Canaan. And along the way, God used empires like the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks, all moving toward this point in time, where all of those empires and all of those leaders and all of those people thought they were in control, and they never really were, because God had a plan all along. And somehow God in his sovereignty, I can't explain to you how it all works and how he does it, that he controls the entire universe, and somehow we are still free human creatures who make free moral decisions. And despite all of that, we cannot derail God's plan. And that's important for us to believe and to know as followers of Jesus. Because sometimes we do a whole lot of hand-wringing about the affairs of things, don't we? So many Christians today, we are so upset about our country. What are we going to do? There's so much political hand-wringing going on on Facebook. You could fill a bathtub with all of the sweat we're wringing out. We're so upset. What's going on? What are we going to do if this party wins? And what are we going to do if that party wins? And what are we going to do about the moral decline of our culture? And everything's falling. We are so worked up about it. When the reality is, God's got it. We get so worked up about things going on in our own lives and the circumstances of our lives. And what are we going to do? And how are we going to survive? And how are we going to make it through this? And the reality is, God's got it. And it's not even hard for him. It's not like he's expending any effort. And it's not just on a universal, generic kind of scale that God's in control of the events of the universe. But he's in control of the direction of the United States of America, but he's also in control of the direction of things going on in Venezuela, in China, and Japan, and anywhere else you want to point to. He's guiding the affairs of those nations. He's guiding the affairs of your life as well, and he's not even struggling to do it. It's not like he turns around and goes, oh, I got to take care of America. And while he's taking care of America, Russia gets out of hand and he's got to run over there and deal with Russia. And then while he's trying to help you out of the bind in your life, somebody else's life is off the rails. No, he's got it. He's got it. And if you want to get picky, he's got it down to the subatomic level, to every atom and neutron and proton in the universe. He is in complete control and he's not even struggling to keep up with it. That's what we mean when we say God is sovereign. And he's got a plan for this world. And he is building a kingdom that nothing or no power and no person on this earth can stop or will be able to stop. God is in control always. And not only is he in control, and not only does he have a plan, he also has a timetable, which is what we see next in our text. So Caiaphas says Jesus has got to go. John says he says this in fulfillment of prophecy. And then in verse 53, they make plans to kill Jesus. Verse 54, Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but he went from there to the region near the wilderness to a town called Ephraim, which was north of Jerusalem near the Samaritan border. And there he stayed with his disciples. And he's going to stay there for about 2 or 3 months until Passover. So here's my question. Why is Jesus running away here? He finds out they're plotting to kill him, and he takes off with his disciples to Ephraim. Why? Is he afraid? Is he scared? Or, because if God's plan, right, if God's got this plan and his plan is for Jesus to die, congratulations, Jesus, you've arrived, right? We've just been told they're making plans to kill you. Perfect. Apparently that was your plan, so why doesn't he just stay right there and they'll kill him, right? Goal accomplished. Well, the reason he leaves is because not only was it God's plan for Jesus to die, but it was God's plan for Jesus to die at the right time. But it wasn't just that Jesus had to go to Jerusalem and get himself killed. He went to Jerusalem and got himself killed at the exact right moment. We can go all the way back to the very first few chapters of the Bible where we see Abel offering the very first recorded, well, the second, if you include when God killed animals to make clothes for Adam and Eve, but Abel offering the first recorded sacrifice to God, where one of the first lambs from his flock had to die. And that pattern continues through Noah and through Abraham and through the patriarchs and on into Moses, where they get the law and it becomes prescribed for all Jews that every year you have to offer an animal sacrifice at the tabernacle or at the temple. And over the period of centuries, literally millions and millions of animals had been bled out upon the altar so that Jewish families could buy one more year's redemption for their sin. And so when Jesus came time for Jesus, it wasn't just that Jesus died. It was that Jesus died during Passover. That as Jesus hung on the cross, the altars in the temple were literally running red with the blood of sacrifices. As Jesus died as the ultimate sacrifice to abolish sacrifice forever, to redeem all humanity, past, present, and future, from their sin. It's no accident that those two things were taking place at the same time, because it was the ultimate fulfillment of everything God had been doing for millennia, being fulfilled in that moment in time. When God didn't just have a plan, God had a timetable for his plan. He's got a timetable for His plan for your life as well. His will be accomplished in His way and in His time. Now, with all of that in mind, with the few minutes we have left today, what practical meaning does this have for any of us in our life this week? That God is sovereign and God is in control. How can that help you when you get up and get ready to go to work tomorrow morning? I think there's 4 important things we can learn from this passage. I think, number 1, because God is sovereign, it means we can be strong in difficult times because God is in control. We can be strong in tough times if we really believe God's got this. I was talking to somebody between services, and that's really the whole key. I say I believe God's got this, but I don't know how well I live like I believe that God's got this. The problem is, in the middle of whatever going through, God's plan a lot of the times will not make sense and we won't understand it. We see that even with the disciples in the weeks ahead. When it comes time for Jesus to die, they didn't get it. They didn't understand what God was doing, even after having spent 3 years with Him. Jesus is arrested, they all run, Jesus gets killed, and they're all crushed. Because that's not how the dream went for them. That's not how they thought the plan was going to play out. And so when God's plan was different, they didn't understand and they didn't get it. And we're all going to have moments where we're like that. We're in the middle of our heartbreak, in the middle of our struggle. It is not likely to make perfect sense. But if we really believe God's in control, we can be strong through that because we know He's got it. A lot of you are probably familiar with the name of Joni Eareckson Tada, who, it's been probably over 40 years ago now, that Joni was injured in a diving accident and became paralyzed from the neck down. For the last 40 years of her life, she hasn't been able to move a muscle below her neck. And not long after that, a few years after that, I was a young teenager when I read her biography chronicling that, so it's been a long time. She writes about the struggle in the midst of all of that process, years where she didn't, well, God, why did, any of us would ask, wouldn't we? God, why did you allow this to happen to me? Any of us would. And she wrestled with that and depression and discouragement just like any of us would. But the great thing about time and distance is sometimes God's plan becomes a little bit more clear. And God has used Joni Eareckson Tada in the years since then to literally lead thousands, who knows how many thousands of people, to faith in Jesus that she never would have reached had she not had her accident. And she's got a wonderful, beautiful attitude and spirit about it now, but she admits sometimes she still struggles. And I read just a few weeks ago, and this broke my heart for myself in so many ways, that she was just a few months ago in a prayer meeting with religious leaders from around the country, and they're all praying together. And at the end of this prayer time, they all got down on the floor and bowed in prayer. And she said, it broke my heart that my head was the highest head in the room. Because Joni can't bow. She can't kneel. She can't get on the floor. And she said she had a bit of a pity party in that moment because she couldn't do what everybody else was doing. And she talked about how I can't wait for the day that's coming when one day I will be able to bow again before my Savior. See, what an awesome example of faith. If we really believe God's sovereign and in control, whatever we're walking through, we can be strong because we know God's got it. Number 2, if God's really in control, it means we need to be humble in our evangelism. It blows my mind in this passage that in light of everything they had seen, all the evidence, all the signs, all of the miracles, and everything Jesus does, it seems to make them disbelieve in Him even harder, right? Like Lazarus, you would think it was a tipping point for a lot of people coming to faith. You would think, if anything, it would make them at least consider Jesus claims he'd been dead for 4 days. Maybe we should even talk about it. And it's interesting, the exact opposite is what has happened. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and it makes them hate him more, in spite of all of the evidence. And like I said earlier, once something reaches worldview status for us, it is hard to see things otherwise. And it's easy for us reading this passage. We know they're the bad guys, right? The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, boo, hiss. If I had been there, I would have believed, right? Well, we should be careful. I hear people say sometimes, if God just would give me a sign, if God would just demonstrate himself clearly just once, then I would believe. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. God could speak audibly to in your room tonight in a clear and loud voice, and you would blame it on the Taco Bell you had for dinner. He could write the gospel in a message in the sky, and if your mindset, if your worldview beforehand was everything has a natural explanation, you would try to find a natural explanation for it. For those of us who are followers of Jesus, though, I think the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin's reaction to Jesus is an important lesson for us in this way. The reality is we could spend billions of dollars building the grandest, most glorious cathedrals this world has ever seen, all in honor and glory, to the honor and glory of Jesus. We could have the most grand and awesome and talented bands the world has ever known, and thank goodness we do. But I mean, we could have the most talented musicians and people in the world. We could have the most polished preachers and speakers who proclaim the gospel more clearly than it has ever been proclaimed. We could go out in our community and love for Jesus and pour our hearts out in service to others and sharing the gospel and caring for the poor and needy. We could do all of those things and do it better than it's ever been done by anybody in history. And the end result of all of that would be it would only cause some people to hate Jesus more. Because in the end, and I need this reminder from time to time, in the end, the success and failure of God's kingdom does not depend on me, and it doesn't depend on you. The reality is we should do all those things I mentioned, by the way, and pour our heart out in service and love for Jesus. But if we do all of that and thousands of people come to faith in Jesus, all the glory goes to God. And if we do all of those things and nobody comes to faith in Jesus, all the glory goes to God. If our team goes to India next week and they come back in a couple weeks proclaiming, woo, we led 500 people to Jesus while we were gone overseas, all glory goes to God. And if they go and they share Jesus faithfully and nobody comes to faith in Jesus, all glory goes to God. Because none of us have ever been responsible for saving anybody. That's the work of the Holy Spirit as He draws people to Himself. So we should have a great deal of humility in our evangelism. It's just an honor that God includes us in this plan in any way in the first place. Number 3, if God is in control, it means we need to be very careful about the danger of pride. I think what kept the Sanhedrin from being able to see Jesus for who He was is they had already made up their minds, right? They were scriptural experts. They knew the Old Testament better than you and I do. They had studied the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah all of their life. And they had come to an expectation of what those scriptures meant and what the Messiah would be. And then when Jesus came, it wasn't the Messiah they expected. And because Jesus didn't fit that mold that they had already made up their mind on, they couldn't see the truth when it was right in front of their face. And it's easy to beat them up for being blinded and doing that when we tend to do the same thing, even as followers of Jesus, all the time. Where we go, Jesus, I'm your disciple, I'm your follower, but I'm really going to treat you in more of an advisory role, right? where the Holy Spirit will be working on you and dealing with you about maybe a sin in your life that He's challenging you about, or stewardship in your finances, or a ministry He wants you to be involved in, or the direction of your family, or whatever. He's dealing with you and working with you, and we tend to go, that is a good plan, Jesus. We're going to call that plan F. And I'm going to take that under advisement. It's a good plan. I like it. But I already had plan A, B, C, D, and E. And so if it's okay with you, Jesus, you come along and we're going to do all of these things before I just do what you asked me to do in the first place. Our pride can get us in every bit as much trouble as it did them when we begin believing that we are in control, and we're not. And then lastly, if God is in control, it means we can be encouraged right now, today, by knowing He's got a plan. And I don't know what that plan is for you in your life and whatever you're facing. And I know some of you, life is grand and glorious right now, and some of you are walking through valleys that seem so big you don't know how you're ever going to get out of it. I realize that. And I don't mean to sound trite in saying this, and sometimes as Christians we do that when we go to people in the midst of the most broken moment of their life. It sounds trite to say, hang in there, buddy, God's got a plan, right? And that's not what I'm trying to do today. The reality is I have no idea why you're going through whatever it is you're going through. If you ask me, I'll tell you, I don't know. God hasn't told me, and He's not likely to. Furthermore, He's not likely to tell you either. There's a whole lot of times in the middle of whatever it is that Jesus asks us to go through, He's not going to share the plan. He's just going to say, follow me. And it may be a lot of times with the benefit of time and space, you look back on this moment 20 years from now and you might be able to say clearly, oh, I see so clearly what you were doing. But in the middle of it, more often than not, God's not going to tell you. He just says, pick up your cross and follow me. Put your hand to the plow and follow me. But you see, as disciples do not get to demand explanations from the Master. It's enough for the disciples simply to know that the Master has a plan and knows what He's doing. And as long as we really believe and trust God knows what He's doing, we can be encouraged in the midst of the most incredible difficulties because we know He knows what He's doing. You see, the encouragement that Paul gives us in Romans chapter 8, turns out it really is true. That for the follower of Christ, Romans 8 says, all things work together for the good of those who are called according to His purpose. And I believe all things really means all things. That means the good things, that means the bad things. And the most encouraging part is that means the things we screw up. The most encouraging part of Romans chapter 8 is all things means even my sin and my brokenness and my fallenness cannot derail the plan of God. And that when I screw up and fall flat on my face tomorrow morning, God says, it's okay, I got it. And He can take even my failure and use it to bring about His glory. God is in control. Always.